Maya Hayes had returned to her hometown only a few months prior. She left the big city, drawn back by a mix of nostalgia and a sense of duty. She was successful, independent, and carried herself with a quiet confidence that some people mistook for aloofness. She knew it well. There was always a certain look that people expected from her, a certain way they expected her to behave. But Maya never conformed, and maybe that was part of what made her presence unsettling to some. She was in her late 20s, had a thriving career in law, and had just secured a position with a prominent civil rights organization that allowed her to make an impact on issues close to her heart. Being back in her hometown was both familiar and unsettling. Small-town life was different from the buzz of the city, and here, despite her education and success, she was reminded that she still carried the weight of certain expectations and, unfortunately, the burden of prejudice. Maya's father, Judge Alan Hayes, was a towering figure in the community. Known for his fairness and dedication, he was one of the few black judges in the state, highly respected but also somewhat feared. He had worked his way up from modest beginnings, and his reputation for unyielding principles made him a symbol of justice in the community. He wasn't just a judge in the legal sense, he was a moral compass for many. But as much as he was respected, there were still unspoken lines that divided the town. People treated him with reverence, yet some still harbored biases that slipped out in subtle ways. Maya had always admired her father's resilience and sense of duty, though she sometimes wondered if his resolve to keep the peace had softened his edge over the years. It was early morning when Maya noticed the smoke. She had just returned from her usual run, the crisp air filling her lungs, her mind still caught between thoughts of work and the to-do list she had mentally prepared for the day. The first wisps of grey curling into the sky seemed almost benign at first, like steam from a chimney. But as she watched, a dark plume rose steadily, spreading in an ominous cloud. Her heart raced as she traced the smoke back to its source, an old house down the street, belonging to Mrs. Walters, a kind but frail woman in her 80s. Maya had often exchanged friendly nods with her. She'd helped her carry groceries once or twice, and she knew the old woman lived alone. Without a second thought, Maya reached for her phone and dialed 911. Her voice was steady as she spoke, but inside, anxiety twisted like a knot. Every second mattered, and she wasn't sure how quickly the emergency services would arrive. She considered running to the house, but logic held her back. She didn't know the structure or the extent of the fire. Going inside recklessly would put both her and Mrs. Walters in danger. All she could do now was wait and hope. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air, a wail growing louder as it approached. Maya's pulse quickened. She stayed at the edge of the property, close enough to see but not in the way. Her instincts told her to stay engaged, to ensure Mrs. Walters was safe, and to help in any way she could. As the fire truck pulled up, she spotted the lead firefighter stepping out, Eric Walker. She had seen him around town a few times but had never interacted with him. He looked to be in his late 30s, fit and strong, with an air of authority that he wore like a second skin. His gaze scanned the scene, landing on Maya with a hint of suspicion. "Can I help you?" Eric asked, his tone curt, as if her very presence irritated him. He didn't seem to consider that she might be there for a legitimate reason. Maya lifted her chin slightly. "I'm the one who called in the fire. I think there's an elderly woman inside." Eric's eyes narrowed as he looked her over. There was a barely hidden disdain in his expression, a flicker of something ugly and unspoken. "We'll handle it," he said, with a dismissive wave. "You can step back." Maya felt a surge of frustration. She was used to encounters like this, interactions where she was treated as though her presence was unwelcome, despite her best intentions. But this was different. Someone's life was potentially on the line, and the lead firefighter was more interested in asserting his authority than understanding the urgency. "Look, I don't know if you realize this, but there's a real risk here. Mrs. Walters is in her 80s. She might not even know there's a fire," Maya said, keeping her tone controlled, though her patience was wearing thin. Eric's jaw tightened, and his gaze hardened. "We don't need anyone telling us how to do our job. This is a controlled situation, ma'am. Just stay out of the way." His tone was laced with impatience, as though he was being inconvenienced by her very presence. Maya took a deep breath, fighting back the urge to argue. She understood how these things went. Sometimes it was better to step aside than to push against walls that wouldn't budge. But the longer she stood there, the more uneasy she felt. The smoke was getting thicker, and a faint crackling sound hinted that the fire was spreading. Just then, an older firefighter stepped out of the truck, looking back at Eric with a questioning glance. "Hey, Chief, want us to do a quick perimeter check?" Eric shot him a look that silenced any further questions. "It's under control," he replied tersely. Maya noticed the exchange and felt her frustration grow. Eric wasn't just dismissing her concerns, he was dismissing the caution of his own team. This was more than arrogance, it was recklessness. Unable to stand idle any longer, Maya spoke up again, her voice steady but insistent. "Look, I understand you're in charge here, but time is ticking, and Mrs. Walters may not have much of it left." Eric's face hardened, and he took a step closer to her, his posture radiating hostility. "I don't need a lecture on what to do. We have protocols, and I don't appreciate you second-guessing me. So unless you want to be cited for obstruction, I suggest you move along." Maya's jaw clenched. She knew that pressing further would only escalate the situation, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Eric was too quick to dismiss her, too eager to reassert his control. Her mind flashed back to conversations she'd had with her father about power, authority, and the weight of prejudice. This was exactly the kind of situation he had warned her about, where prejudice and pride collided, often with disastrous consequences. Taking a step back, Maya decided on a different approach. She didn't want to make things worse, but she also couldn't let herself stand by and do nothing. "I'm Judge Alan Hayes' daughter," she said, her voice calm but firm. "If there's any issue with me being here, I'm sure he'd be happy to discuss it with you." For a brief moment, a flicker of recognition crossed Eric's face, but it quickly disappeared. He scoffed, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah, sure, everyone's someone important these days. Move back, or I'll have to call for police support." Maya felt a surge of anger but held it back. She knew she couldn't afford to let her emotions take over, not when Mrs. Walters' life was potentially at risk. She retreated a few steps, but stayed close enough to observe. The firefighters were finally setting up hoses, moving with measured speed, but there was still a sense of casualness to their actions, as if they didn't fully believe this was an emergency. And Eric, their leader, continued to cast glances her way, his expression full of disdain. Maya clenched her fists, feeling the familiar sting of frustration and powerlessness. She'd been through too many situations where her words were ignored, where her actions were dismissed, all because of someone's prejudice. But this time it wasn't just about her. It was about Mrs. Walters, an innocent woman whose life was hanging in the balance because of one man's arrogance. She silently resolved that she wouldn't let this go unanswered. One way or another, she would make sure that justice was served, even if it meant challenging the very people who were supposed to protect. Maya stood back reluctantly, her eyes fixed on the house as the smoke grew thicker. She could feel the tension building in her chest, a mixture of frustration and helplessness. The firefighters were moving with a calm, almost leisurely pace, setting up their equipment under Eric's command. It was painfully clear to her that he didn't see this situation as urgent. Perhaps if someone else had called it in, or if she looked different, he might have reacted more seriously. But instead, she felt like she was watching a disaster unfold in slow motion, powerless to intervene. The more she observed, the more it confirmed her fears. The team under Eric's direction wasn't preparing for a full-scale rescue. They were treating it as a minor incident, as though they were just there to put out a contained fire. She watched one of the firefighters grab a small hose, clearly not suited for a larger blaze, while others stood by, waiting for instructions. Every second that ticked by made her more certain that they were wasting valuable time. Unable to hold back any longer, Maya stepped forward again, raising her voice. "Look, I'm telling you, there's an elderly woman inside. She's in her 80s. She might not even know what's happening. You need to check the house immediately." Eric turned to her, his face twisting with irritation. He was clearly not used to being questioned, least of all by a civilian he already held in low regard. His voice was sharp, laced with condescension. "Ma'am, I've already told you. We have it under control. This isn't my first fire. If there's someone inside, we'll find them. But I'm not going to have you dictate our procedures to us." Maya took a steadying breath, feeling her patience stretch thin. "I'm not dictating anything. I'm trying to make sure someone's life isn't lost because of a delay. Every minute matters." Eric let out a scoff, glancing at his team as if to share a private joke at her expense. "We don't take instructions from spectators," he said, his tone mocking. "Now, if you don't want to get in trouble, I'd suggest you step back and let us do our jobs." One of the younger firefighters, a man who looked barely out of training, shot a quick glance at Eric, then at Maya. He looked uncomfortable, clearly sensing the tension, but unsure of how to intervene. Maya caught his eye and saw a glimmer of concern there, as though he too was beginning to question the way things were being handled. But he quickly averted his gaze, unwilling to openly defy his superior. Maya could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. She had faced condescending figures before, had learned to pick her battles. But this was different. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for an innocent woman who could be trapped inside that burning house. Her father's words echoed in her mind, warnings about the dangers of unchecked authority, about the people who were too eager to wield power without accountability. She took another step forward, her voice steady but firm. "I'm Judge Hayes' daughter, as I already mentioned, and I am insisting that you take this situation seriously. If anything happens to Mrs. Walters because you ignored the warning signs, there will be consequences." For a brief moment, a flicker of recognition crossed Eric's face. The mention of her father's name seemed to resonate, but just as quickly he dismissed it with a smirk. "Oh, you think dropping your daddy's name is going to change anything here?" He sneered. "Let me make this clear, this is my scene. I'm the one in charge and I decide the priorities. Not you, not your father, and not anyone else." Maya felt her frustration spike, but she forced herself to stay calm. She knew that if she showed anger, it would only confirm whatever negative assumptions he already held about her. She couldn't afford to give him that satisfaction. But as she stood there, feeling the weight of his dismissive glare, she was reminded of every barrier she'd faced, every time her voice had been ignored or minimized. As if to punctuate the tension, the older firefighter who had initially questioned Eric's decisions approached them. He looked at Maya, then back at Eric, a crease of worry on his face. "Chief, maybe we should do a sweep of the house, just in case. There's quite a bit of smoke coming from the lower level. It might be worse than it looks." Eric shot him a cold look, clearly annoyed at the suggestion. "I said it's under control, didn't I?" His voice was low, laced with warning. "You follow my lead and I say we're handling it. We don't need unnecessary panic." Maya clenched her fists, biting back a retort. She could see the tension in the older firefighter's face, the reluctance to question his superior openly. But his hesitation was all Maya needed to confirm her suspicion. She wasn't the only one who thought this situation was being mishandled. Even within his own team, there was doubt. A thought flashed through her mind: if she couldn't convince Eric directly, maybe she could go around him. She stepped towards the older firefighter, catching his attention. "Listen," she said quietly, her tone pleading. "If there's even a chance that someone is inside, wouldn't it be worth checking? Just for peace of mind." He looked at her, his face conflicted. It was clear he didn't want to disobey Eric, but her words struck a chord. He nodded slightly, as if acknowledging her concern, but before he could respond, Eric stepped between them, blocking her view. "That's enough," he snapped, his voice icy. "I don't need you undermining my authority in front of my team. You've made your point, now step back or I'll have you escorted off the property." Maya felt her stomach twist with frustration and disbelief. This man was willing to risk lives just to assert his authority, just to prove he was in charge. She wanted to scream, to shake him out of his arrogance, but she knew that would only make things worse. Instead, she held his gaze, her own eyes steady and unyielding. "If anything happens to her, it's on you," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "Remember that." Eric's face hardened, but he didn't respond. He turned away, signaling to his team to begin spraying water at the visible flames. Maya watched, feeling a mixture of anger and helplessness. She wanted to believe that they would do the right thing, that they would check the house thoroughly. But as she observed their half-hearted efforts, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. The younger firefighter glanced at her again, a look of discomfort in his eyes. She wondered if he might be the key, if he might be willing to go against orders to do what was right. She locked eyes with him, silently pleading. But before anything could happen, Eric barked another command, and the firefighter looked away, unwilling to risk further confrontation. Maya took a step back, realizing that there was nothing more she could do in that moment. She could feel the frustration boiling inside her, the familiar ache of being ignored, of seeing prejudice and arrogance cloud someone's judgment. But she wouldn't give up. She would find a way to hold Eric accountable, to make sure this wouldn't go unchallenged. As she stood there, watching the scene unfold, she noticed something alarming. The smoke was getting darker, thicker. The fire wasn't just in one isolated area, it was spreading fast. And she knew, with a sinking feeling, that Eric's delay had cost them precious time. Eric's team finally began to respond with more urgency, but it was clear that they were now in catch-up mode, struggling to control a fire that had grown beyond their initial assessment. Maya's heart pounded as she watched, her hands clenching at her sides. She knew that every second mattered, and she couldn't help but think about Mrs. Walters, alone in that house, possibly still unaware of the danger. In that moment, Maya made a silent vow. No matter the outcome today, she wouldn't let this incident fade away. She would make sure the truth came out, that people knew what had happened here. And she would make sure that Eric, and anyone else who thought they could ignore a life based on arrogance or bias, would face the consequences. The smoke continued to rise, filling the sky with a dark, ominous cloud, a warning to everyone watching that sometimes the real danger wasn't the fire itself but the people who refused to see it. Maya stood back, her heart racing as she watched the flames flicker within the shadows of Mrs. Walters's old house. The smoke was thicker now, curling into the sky in heavy plumes that seemed to darken with every passing moment. It was obvious to her that this wasn't just a small, controllable fire, it was spreading, dangerously close to engulfing the structure. Every instinct in her screamed that Mrs. Walters's life was hanging by a thread, and the precious seconds ticking by were being wasted due to one man's pride and prejudice. Eric continued to bark orders to his team, his face set in a scowl that left no room for questioning his authority. Maya noticed the younger firefighter again, the one who'd caught her eye earlier. He was hesitant, visibly uncomfortable with the way things were being handled, but he remained silent, casting nervous glances toward his chief, as though struggling to summon the courage to speak up. Taking a deep breath, Maya stepped forward again, determined to get anyone to take her seriously. "Excuse me," she called out, addressing the younger firefighter directly. "I know you're following protocol, but it's clear that this fire is spreading quickly. Shouldn't someone go inside and check for anyone who might be trapped?" The firefighter glanced at her, his eyes shifting between her and Eric, who was busy directing the setup of hoses. She could see the conflict on his face, the desire to act mingled with the fear of going against his superior. "Ma'am, we're handling it," he said finally, his voice low, almost apologetic. Maya clenched her fists, frustration surging through her. "Handling it," she repeated, her tone thick with disbelief. "By standing around and waiting for the fire to burn itself out. There's an elderly woman inside that house. She could be trapped, or even unconscious, and you're just standing here. Don't you realize what's at stake?" Eric turned sharply at the sound of her voice, his eyes narrowing as he strode over to her, radiating barely concealed irritation. "What part of stay out of the way do you not understand?" he demanded, his tone dripping with condescension. "We are trained professionals. This isn't some spectator sport where you get to shout orders from the sidelines." Maya held her ground, meeting his glare head-on. "And what part of there's a life in danger do you not understand?" she shot back, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Every second you waste here arguing with me is a second that Mrs. Walters could be losing her life. You have the equipment, the training, why aren't you using it to save her?" Eric's face flushed, his jaw tightening as he clenched his fists at his sides. For a brief, tense moment they stood there, locked in a battle of wills, his authority pitted against her determination. Maya could see the disbelief and irritation flickering in his eyes, as though he couldn't fathom why she was so persistent, why she refused to back down. Without breaking eye contact, Eric took a slow, deliberate step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerously low tone. "I don't need some self-important civilian telling me how to do my job," he hissed, barely containing his contempt. "So unless you want to be removed from this scene, I suggest you keep your mouth shut and let us work." Maya's heart pounded, but she refused to flinch. She knew that any sign of weakness would only embolden him, would only confirm whatever preconceived notions he had about her. She had dealt with people like Eric before, people who thought they were untouchable, who wielded their authority like a weapon to silence those who challenged them. But this was different. This wasn't about ego or pride, this was about life and death. "Then do your job," she replied evenly, her voice laced with quiet intensity. "Because from where I'm standing, it doesn't look like you're interested in saving lives, it looks like you're more interested in proving a point. And if something happens to Mrs. Walters because of that, it won't just be on your conscience, it'll be on your record." Eric's eyes flashed, a mixture of anger and disdain darkening his expression. He opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, the crackling sound of flames intensified, drawing their attention back to the house. The fire had spread to the front porch, licking at the wooden beams with hungry tongues of flame. The sight sent a chill down Maya's spine, her worst fears materializing right before her eyes. One of the other firefighters, an older man with graying hair and a solemn expression, approached Eric, his face etched with concern. "Chief, this fire's getting worse," he said quietly, casting a quick, worried glance toward the house. We might want to do a sweep of the ground floor at least, just to be sure there's no one inside. Eric's face hardened, his pride clearly at odds with the reality of the situation. Maya could see the conflict playing out in his eyes, the stubbornness battling with the creeping realization that he might have underestimated the danger. For a moment she dared to hope that he would relent, that he would allow his team to act before it was too late. But then he shook his head, his jaw set in a stubborn line. "We're not rushing into anything," he insisted, his tone cold and unyielding. "We'll proceed as planned. There's no need for unnecessary risks." Maya's hope shattered, replaced by a surge of frustration so intense it was almost overwhelming. She couldn't stand by and watch this unfold any longer. Without thinking, she pushed past Eric, heading toward the house with determined strides. If they wouldn't act, then she would. She had no intention of putting herself in harm's way, but she couldn't ignore the possibility that Mrs. Walters might be in there, helpless and alone. Eric's shout stopped her in her tracks. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" His voice was sharp, laced with barely controlled anger. Maya turned to face him, her gaze steady, resolute. "I'm going to make sure Mrs. Walters is safe," she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Because clearly you're more interested in arguing with me than actually doing something." Eric's face twisted with fury, and he took a step forward, his posture rigid with barely suppressed rage. "You're not authorized to go in there," he snarled. "You don't have the equipment, the training, or the right. And if you try, I will personally make sure you're removed from this scene and cited for obstruction." Maya squared her shoulders, refusing to back down. "Then do something. Stop wasting time arguing with me and do your job. Go in there and make sure Mrs. Walters is safe, or are you afraid that admitting I might be right would hurt your ego?" Her words seemed to hit a nerve. Eric's face turned a shade darker, his hands clenching into fists as he fought to maintain his composure. For a brief, tense moment, it seemed as though he might explode, his anger boiling over. But then, with a curt nod, he turned to his team, his voice cold and clipped. "Fine," he snapped. "Do a sweep of the ground floor. But make it quick." The older firefighter gave Maya a brief nod of gratitude before signaling to two younger members of the team, who immediately moved toward the house, their faces tense and focused. Maya watched them go, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and anxiety. She had won this small victory, but the battle was far from over. As the firefighters entered the house, a heavy silence settled over the scene, broken only by the crackling of flames and the distant wail of sirens. Maya stood at the edge of the property, her gaze fixed on the house, praying that they would find Mrs. Walters in time. She could feel Eric's glare burning into her, his anger palpable, but she forced herself to ignore it. Right now, all that mattered was making sure that an innocent life wasn't lost. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. The smoke continued to thicken, darkening the sky as the fire grew more intense. Maya's stomach twisted with dread, the fear gnawing at her as she waited, helpless to do anything but hope. Finally, after what felt like an agonizing eternity, the firefighters emerged from the house, supporting an elderly woman between them. Mrs. Walters looked dazed, her face smudged with soot, her frail body trembling as she clung to the firefighters. Maya's heart soared with relief, a wave of gratitude washing over her as she watched them guide Mrs. Walters to safety. But her relief was short-lived. As the firefighters helped Mrs. Walters to the waiting ambulance, Eric stormed over to her, his face contorted with fury. "Are you satisfied now?" he demanded, his voice cold and biting. "You just had to interfere, didn't you? Had to make this all about you." Maya met his glare, unflinching. "This was never about me. It was about doing what was right. And if I hadn't pushed you, Mrs. Walters might still be in there, trapped. So yes, I'm satisfied because she's alive." Eric's face twisted with contempt, and for a moment she thought he might retaliate, that his anger would drive him to lash out. But then he turned abruptly, stalking away without another word, leaving her standing there, shaken but resolute. As the fire continued to smolder, Maya knew that this was far from over. Eric's anger and pride had almost cost her life, and she couldn't let that go unchallenged. She had seen too many people like him, too many authority figures who let their egos cloud their judgment. This was her moment, her chance to make sure that someone like him faced the consequences of his actions. Watching the firefighters work, Maya made a silent promise. She would not let this injustice fade into obscurity. She would hold Eric accountable, not just for herself or Mrs. Walters, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed or ignored by someone in a position of power. This was only the beginning. Maya watched as the ambulance carrying Mrs. Walters pulled away, her chest tight with a mixture of relief and simmering anger. The fire was now mostly under control, the dark smoke beginning to thin as Eric's team worked tirelessly to extinguish the last of the flames. But for Maya, the real fire was far from extinguished. She couldn't shake the image of Eric's face, twisted in disdain as he dismissed her pleas, his arrogance almost costing an innocent life. She knew she couldn't let it go. Eric had crossed a line, and she was determined to make sure he was held accountable for his reckless decisions. The younger firefighter, the one who'd caught her eye earlier, approached her cautiously. He looked uneasy, as though he wasn't sure whether he should speak up but felt compelled to do so. "Ma'am," he began, glancing over his shoulder to make sure Eric was out of earshot. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry about everything that happened. You were right about the fire spreading faster than we thought." Maya looked at him, studying his face. She saw sincerity there, along with a hint of guilt. "Thank you," she replied, her tone soft but firm. "It's not your fault. But you saw what happened, right? You saw how Chief Walker refused to take the situation seriously." The firefighter hesitated, clearly conflicted. "Yes, Maram, I did. But Eric's the chief. It's not easy to go against him, you know. He's been in charge for years, and he doesn't take kindly to people questioning him." Maya's expression softened, though her resolve remained firm. "I understand. But there comes a point when doing the right thing is more important than following orders. People's lives are at stake. I don't want this to be swept under the rug." The firefighter shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at his boots. "I know. Look, I don't agree with what happened today. I think you were treated unfairly, and I think Mrs. Walters almost paid the price for that. But I don't know what I can do about it. If I speak up, I could lose my job." Maya nodded slowly, understanding the difficult position he was in. She was no stranger to the consequences of standing up to authority. But she also knew that silence only allowed injustice to flourish. "You don't have to do this alone," she said gently. "I'm going to make sure this is addressed, one way or another. If you're willing to support me, even quietly, it could make a difference." He looked at her, his eyes conflicted but earnest. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. With a final nod, he turned and walked away, leaving Maya standing alone by the remnants of the fire, her mind racing with a plan. As she turned to leave, she noticed her father's car pulling up nearby. Judge Alan Hayes stepped out, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene, taking in the scorched house, the fire truck, and his daughter standing amidst the aftermath. He approached her with a calm, measured stride, his gaze flicking between her and the firefighters packing up their equipment. "Maya," he said, his voice steady but laced with concern. "I heard about what happened here. Are you all right?" Maya nodded, though her face betrayed the anger simmering just beneath the surface. "I'm fine, Dad." But Mrs. Walters almost wasn't. She was trapped inside, and Chief Walker refused to act. If I hadn't pushed him, I don't know what would have happened. Her father's face tightened, a hint of disapproval crossing his features. "Maya, I understand that you were upset, but you have to be careful about challenging people in authority, especially in situations like this. There are protocols in place for a reason." Maya felt a surge of frustration. She had anticipated this response from her father, the calm voice of reason that so often left her feeling unheard. "Protocols," she repeated, her tone edged with disbelief. "Dad, I watched him ignore the danger, dismiss me, and nearly put a woman's life at risk because of his ego. Protocols mean nothing if the person in charge is willing to ignore them out of pride or prejudice." Judge Hayes sighed, looking around as though he didn't want anyone to overhear. "Maya, I know Chief Walker. He's been part of this community for a long time. I'm not saying he's perfect, but there are ways to address these issues without creating unnecessary conflict." Maya stared at him, feeling a pang of disappointment. She had hoped that her father, a man who had dedicated his life to justice, would support her in her quest to hold Eric accountable. But now, she saw that his respect for authority was clouding his judgment, making him reluctant to take action. "So, you're saying I should just let this go?" she asked, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Pretend that nothing happened, that Mrs. Walters's life wasn't put in danger because of his negligence?" Her father met her gaze, his face lined with concern. "I'm saying that we need to approach this carefully. If you come at him too aggressively, it could backfire. People in power don't like to be challenged, and they have ways of protecting themselves." Maya looked away, a cold knot of anger forming in her stomach. "Maybe that's the problem, Dad. Maybe the reason people like Eric think they can get away with this kind of behavior is because no one ever challenges them." Judge Hayes sighed again, reaching out to place a comforting hand on her shoulder. "I know you're frustrated, Maya, and I'm not asking you to ignore what happened. But think about the bigger picture. Sometimes, the only way to change things is from within the system. We need to be strategic." Maya shook her head, her jaw set in determination. "I've tried playing by the rules, Dad, but there comes a point when the system itself is part of the problem. If no one ever speaks up, then nothing will ever change." Her father studied her for a long moment, as though weighing her words. Finally, he nodded, his expression softening. "Just be careful. The world isn't always fair, and people like Eric Walker don't take kindly to being exposed. If you're going to go through with this, make sure you're prepared for the consequences." Maya managed a small, sad smile. "I've been dealing with consequences my whole life, Dad. I'm not going to let this go." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving her father standing alone by the edge of the scene. She could feel his gaze on her back, a mixture of pride and apprehension that she knew he wouldn't express aloud. But she didn't need his permission. This was her fight, and she was prepared to see it through. Over the next few days, Maya began gathering information, determined to build a case against Eric. She reached out to a few people in the community who had expressed frustration with the fire department's handling of past incidents, gathering testimonies that painted a picture of a man whose ego often outweighed his responsibility. She knew that her fight wouldn't be easy. Eric was well connected and respected by some, but she also knew that there were cracks in his reputation, whispers of past mistakes that had gone unaddressed. The younger firefighter, the one who had expressed sympathy for her that day, finally agreed to meet with her in private. They sat in a small cafe, the air tense as he spoke in a hushed voice, glancing around nervously to make sure they weren't overheard. "I need you to understand," he said, his hands clenched around his coffee cup, that going against Eric could cost me everything. My career, my reputation. He has connections, but I also know that what he did was wrong. And I can't keep pretending like it's okay. Maya reached across the table, her hand resting on his in a gesture of solidarity. You're not alone in this. I'll do everything I can to protect you. But if we don't speak out, this will keep happening. People like Eric rely on fear to keep others in line. If we stand together, we can change that. He nodded slowly, the determination in his eyes growing as he took a deep breath. I'll help. I'll tell the truth about what happened that day. And if anyone asks, I'll say that it's time for things to change in this department. They spent the next few hours going over his account of the incident, recording his statement and gathering additional evidence. Maya could feel the momentum building, the sense that they were on the brink of something significant. She knew it wouldn't be easy, and that Eric would fight back with everything he had. But for the first time since the fire, she felt a glimmer of hope. Her father, though still cautious, began to offer his quiet support, advising her on the best way to approach the legal aspects of the case. Though he was reluctant to confront Eric directly, he couldn't deny the strength of the evidence she had gathered. Slowly, the tension between them eased, replaced by a mutual understanding that sometimes justice required taking risks. As Maya prepared to file an official complaint, she knew that her actions would send shockwaves through the community. Eric's connections and reputation might shield him temporarily, but she was no longer afraid. This was about more than one incident. It was about standing up to a system that protected those in power at the expense of those they were supposed to serve. Standing outside the courthouse with her father by her side, Maya took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision settle on her shoulders. This was only the beginning, but she was ready for whatever came next. Together, they stepped inside, ready to face the battle head-on. As the days passed, the tension surrounding the incident at Mrs. Walters's house rippled through the community. Whispers grew into full-blown discussions, and Maya found herself at the center of a brewing storm. People were talking at the grocery store, on street corners, at local diners, and not all of it was in her favor. Some defended Eric, claiming he was a seasoned professional who didn't deserve this witch hunt. Others, however, supported Maya, recognizing her courage in challenging someone who had long been a fixture of authority in their town. Maya had expected resistance, but the sheer intensity of it took her by surprise. She began receiving anonymous messages, some of them supportive, others filled with thinly veiled threats. The community seemed polarized, and the lines were drawn sharply. Friends became cautious, neighbors turned distant, and she could feel the weight of judgment from both sides pressing down on her. But she couldn't let herself be intimidated. She had come too far to back down now. The younger firefighter, Chris, who had risked his position by supporting her, was facing his own struggles. Rumors had started circulating within the fire department, suggesting that he was disloyal and stirring up trouble. Eric, sensing a threat to his authority, began to isolate Chris, assigning him menial tasks, refusing to acknowledge his input during training sessions, and subtly encouraging other team members to keep their distance. Chris confided in Maya during one of their late-night meetings, his face pale and drawn with exhaustion. "He's making my life a living hell," he admitted, his voice thick with frustration. "Every time I walk into the station, I feel like I'm walking into enemy territory. It's like they've branded me a traitor." Maya's heart ached for him. She knew that his situation was a direct result of his decision to stand by her. "I'm so sorry, Chris," she said softly. "I didn't mean for this to happen to you. I know this is hard, but your courage, it means everything. Without you, none of this would be possible." Chris managed a weak smile. "I just didn't realize it would cost so much." I thought. He paused, shaking his head. "I thought standing up for the right thing would feel, I don't know, different. less lonely. Maya reached across the table, squeezing his hand in a gesture of solidarity. You're not alone. We're in this together. And I promise, whatever happens, I'll make sure your bravery doesn't go unnoticed. Despite her reassurances, Maya knew that Chris was on the verge of breaking. She could see the toll it was taking on him, the weariness in his eyes, the weight he carried in his posture. It was one thing to face an adversary from a distance, it was another to confront that adversary daily, under the unrelenting scrutiny of his peers. The situation came to a head one afternoon when Maya received a summons from the fire department's disciplinary committee. They wanted to question her about the allegations she had made against Eric, to assess whether there was enough evidence to warrant further investigation. She knew that this was her opportunity to present her case formally, but it was also a test. If she failed to convince them, Eric would walk away unscathed, his power intact, while her reputation and Chris's would be left in tatters. Maya arrived at the fire department headquarters, her father by her side. Judge Hayes had initially been reluctant to get involved, wary of the repercussions, but as the gravity of the situation became clear, he had offered his quiet support. He couldn't appear to favor her too openly, it would raise questions about impartiality in his position, but he could provide advice and guidance, and his presence lent her strength. As they entered the austere meeting room, Maya's eyes landed on Eric, who was seated at the far end of the table. His expression was one of cold confidence, a smugness that sent a shiver of anger down her spine. He was flanked by his attorney, a sharp-eyed woman with a steely gaze who seemed to scrutinize Maya as she walked in. The other members of the committee, a mix of fire department officials and community representatives, sat in silence, their faces guarded. The chair of the committee, a man in his 60s with a stern expression, cleared his throat. Ms. Hayes, thank you for coming. We're here to discuss the events of last week and your allegations against Chief Walker. This is a serious matter, and we want to ensure that all voices are heard. Please begin by outlining your account of the incident. Maya took a deep breath, steadying herself. She began to recount the events in detail, her voice calm but filled with a quiet intensity. She spoke of the initial dismissal, the growing danger, and Eric's refusal to act despite her warnings. She described the moment when he finally relented, allowing the firefighters to conduct a sweep, and how Mrs. Walters had been found, dazed and disoriented, but alive. Throughout her testimony, Eric sat motionless, his eyes fixed on her with a look of barely concealed contempt. When she finished, his attorney leaned forward, her lips curling into a faint smirk. Ms. Hayes, thank you for your account, she began smoothly. But I have to ask, do you have any concrete evidence that Chief Walker acted negligently? Or are we simply taking your word for it? Maya felt a spark of anger flare in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. I don't need concrete evidence to prove that Mrs. Walters's life was in danger, she replied, her voice steady. The smoke was visible, the fire was spreading, and Chief Walker chose to ignore my warnings. That's negligence, whether you have it on paper or not. Eric's attorney raised an eyebrow, a look of feigned sympathy on her face. With all due respect, Ms. Hayes, it sounds to me like you're drawing conclusions based on personal bias. Perhaps you felt that you weren't being listened to and decided to make this issue about race, about authority, rather than the actual facts. Maya's father placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, grounding her. What my daughter is saying, he interjected in his calm, authoritative voice, is that negligence doesn't always require direct evidence. In life or death situations, sometimes judgment alone can be an indicator of failure. A flicker of uncertainty crossed the faces of the committee members. Maya seized the opportunity. And I'm not the only one who witnessed this. Chris, one of the firefighters on the scene, can attest to the fact that Chief Walker ignored his own team's recommendations. He put his ego above the safety of a civilian, and that's a serious issue. Eric's attorney glanced sharply at her client, her mask of confidence slipping for a moment. Maya could tell that Chris's potential testimony had rattled them. But before she could press further, Eric spoke up, his voice dripping with derision. Ms. Hayes has her version of events, he said, his gaze never wavering from hers. But as the chief in charge, I made decisions based on the information available to me. Fires are unpredictable, and there's a reason we have protocols in place. Her accusations are baseless and, frankly, insulting to the work we do. Maya's heart pounded with frustration. His dismissive tone, his arrogance, it all confirmed everything she already knew about him. But she couldn't let her emotions cloud her response. Respectfully, Chief Walker, she said, forcing herself to keep her tone measured, your so-called protocols almost cost an elderly woman her life. If you can't see that, then maybe you shouldn't be in this position. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. She could see the discomfort on the faces of the committee members, the realization that this wasn't just a petty grievance. This was a matter of life and death, of responsibility and accountability. And Eric's casual dismissal of her concerns only made it clearer that he had no intention of admitting fault. After what felt like an eternity, the committee chair cleared his throat. Thank you, Ms. Hayes, Chief Walker. We will consider the statements presented today and follow up accordingly. Maya left the meeting feeling a strange mix of hope and dread. She knew she had made a strong case, but she also understood that Eric's influence ran deep. He had friends in high places, people who would defend him regardless of his actions. Still, she refused to let herself dwell on the possibility of failure. She had come this far, and she wouldn't back down now. Over the following week, tensions continued to rise. Eric's behavior became more erratic as he faced increased scrutiny. He began lashing out at his team, particularly Chris, whose life at the station had become unbearable. Rumors circulated that Eric was trying to dig up dirt on Maya, looking for any detail that could discredit her. She heard whispers that he was questioning her motives, framing her actions as a vendetta rather than a genuine concern for justice. Then, one evening, Maya received a call from Chris. His voice was shaky, barely a whisper. Maya, I can't do this anymore. Eric confronted me today, said he'd make sure I never work again if I don't retract my statement. I don't know what to do. Maya's heart sank. She knew Eric was ruthless, but she hadn't anticipated he would go to such lengths to protect himself. Chris, listen to me, she said gently, trying to infuse her words with strength. You did the right thing. And no matter what he says, there are people who support you. You're not alone in this. But Chris's voice broke. I don't know if it's worth it, Maya. The job, the stress, he's ruining my life. Maya felt a pang of guilt, but she knew she couldn't let him give in. Eric is trying to scare you because he knows you're a threat. If we give up now, he'll keep doing this. To you, to me, to anyone who challenges him. We have to see this through. For a moment, Chris was silent, his breathing uneven. Finally, he took a shaky breath. All right, I'll stick with it. But if this doesn't work, I don't know what else I can do. As the call ended, Maya sat alone, the weight of their struggle pressing down on her. She knew that Eric wouldn't back down easily, that he would fight tooth and nail to protect his reputation. But she was ready. Whatever it took, she would see this battle to the end, for Chris, for Mrs. Walters, and for everyone who had ever been silenced by someone like Eric. As the tension reached a boiling point, Maya knew that the confrontation she had been building toward was inevitable. The disciplinary committee was reconvening to announce their decision, and rumors were circulating that this would either be a turning point for Eric or for her. The stakes felt impossibly high. For Maya, this was more than just a personal battle. It was a stand against the entire culture of unchecked authority and prejudice that allowed people like Eric to operate without accountability. And for Chris, this would determine whether he would still have a future in the fire department or whether he'd be branded as a troublemaker for life. The meeting room was filled with a heavy, oppressive silence as Maya, Chris, and a small crowd of townspeople gathered. Maya spotted her father, Judge Hayes, standing off to the side. His face was impassive, but his eyes held a look of steely resolve that told her he was here to support her, regardless of the consequences. She took a deep breath, centering herself, and gave Chris a reassuring nod. They were in this together. Eric walked into the room, flanked by his attorney, his expression unreadable, but his posture radiating confidence. He looked like a man who believed he had already won, and his calm arrogance made Maya's blood boil. She tightened her grip on the small folder of documents and witness statements she had collected, determined to stay calm and focused. The committee members took their seats, and the chair cleared his throat, signaling the beginning of the session. Today, we're here to address the allegations made against Chief Walker, including claims of negligence, abuse of power, and inappropriate behavior toward members of the public. Both sides have submitted statements and supporting evidence. We will now hear any final testimonies before we reach our decision. Eric's attorney stood up first, her voice smooth and practiced. Members of the committee, the accusations against my client are nothing more than a coordinated smear campaign, rooted in personal vendettas rather than facts. Chief Walker has served this community with distinction for years. His decisions on the day in question were made based on his professional assessment, not on any so-called bias or negligence. She cast a quick, disdainful glance at Maya and Chris before continuing. Furthermore, we believe that Ms. Hayes and her supporters are exploiting this situation to damage Chief Walker's reputation for their own purposes. Without substantial evidence to back these claims, we request that this committee dismiss the allegations entirely. Maya clenched her jaw but held her tongue. She had expected them to try to discredit her, to paint her as an agitator with ulterior motives, but she knew she couldn't let their accusations shake her resolve. The chair turned to Maya. Ms. Hayes, do you have any final statements before we deliberate? Maya stood, feeling the weight of the room's gaze settle on her. She steadied herself, channeling all the frustration, the anger, and the sense of purpose that had carried her this far. I understand that Chief Walker has served this community for many years, she began, her voice firm. But longevity doesn't excuse negligence, and authority should never shield anyone from accountability. What happened that day was not just a mistake, it was a deliberate choice to ignore warnings, to dismiss the concerns of a community member, and to risk a life out of pride. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. I have no vendetta. I'm here because I believe that the people who are meant to protect us should not put their own egos above the safety of others. Mrs. Walters's life was in danger, and Chief Walker chose to ignore that. If we let this go unchallenged, we're saying that some lives matter less than others, and I refuse to accept that. The room was silent. Maya could see the flicker of doubt in some of the committee members' eyes, and she knew her words had struck a chord. She turned to Chris, giving him a supportive nod. It was his turn to speak, and she knew how much courage it took for him to be here today, knowing the consequences he faced. Chris stood, his hands trembling slightly but his voice steady. I don't want to be here, accusing my superior, he began, his voice thick with emotion. But I was there that day. I saw the way Chief Walker dismissed Ms. Hayes, the way he ignored warnings from his own team, I've spent my life believing that being a firefighter means putting others first no matter what. But that's not what happened. And if we don't hold each other accountable, then we're failing the people we're supposed to protect. Eric's face twisted with barely concealed fury, and Maya could see the tension in his jaw as he struggled to keep his composure. He finally stood, addressing the committee in a tone laced with indignation. Are we really going to let a few exaggerated complaints ruin a career built over decades? He demanded, his voice rising. I've risked my life time and again for this town. I don't need to be lectured by people who have no idea what it means to make life and death decisions. He turned to Maya, his eyes narrowing. And as for MS Hayes, I think it's clear she's using this as an opportunity to play hero, to make herself look like some kind of crusader. But let's be real, she doesn't know the first thing about firefighting or what it's like to be in the field. Maya felt a surge of anger, but she remained composed, refusing to let him bait her. Instead, she looked directly at the committee, her gaze steady and unyielding. This isn't about firefighting, she said, her voice quiet but filled with conviction. This is about integrity, about whether we're willing to stand up and say that no one is above accountability, not even a chief.
The chair of the committee nodded, his expression serious. Thank you, MS Hayes. We will now deliberate in private. Please wait outside.
Maya, Chris, and the others filed out of the room, the heavy silence thick with tension. They waited in the hallway, each passing minute feeling like an eternity. Maya could feel her heart pounding, every beat a reminder of what was at stake. She glanced over at Chris, who looked pale and exhausted, but he managed a small, encouraging smile. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened, and the committee members filed back in, their expressions grave. The chair took his seat, glancing around the room before speaking. After careful consideration of the statements and evidence presented, the committee has reached a decision, he announced, his tone neutral. Chief Eric Walker, it is the determination of this committee that your actions on the day in question were indeed negligent, and that your behavior toward MS Hayes and other concerned parties was inappropriate and unprofessional. As such, we are recommending disciplinary action. A murmur ran through the room, a mixture of shock and relief. Eric's face went pale, his confident facade crumbling as the weight of the decision settled on him. His attorney leaned over, whispering urgently in his ear, but Eric's expression was one of stunned disbelief. The chair continued. Given the severity of the incident and the potential risk to civilian life, we have determined that Chief Walker's position will be suspended pending further review. Additionally, Chief Walker will be required to undergo training focused on professionalism and community engagement before any consideration of reinstatement. Maya felt a wave of relief wash over her, the tension in her shoulders easing as the decision sank in. She glanced over at Chris, who looked equally stunned, his face a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. They had done it. They had stood up to someone in power, and they had won. As the room began to clear, Eric turned to her, his face contorted with fury. You think this is over? He spat, his voice low and filled with venom. You just made a powerful enemy, MS Hayes. Don't think I'll forget this. Maya met his gaze, her expression calm and unafraid. I didn't come here to make friends, Chief Walker. I came here to make sure that people like you don't get to put lives at risk without consequence. Eric's scowl deepened, but before he could respond, his attorney pulled him away, whispering urgently in his ear. Maya watched him go, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over her. She knew that this wasn't the end, that people like Eric didn't simply disappear. But she also knew that she had done the right thing, and that was a victory in itself. Outside, she found her father waiting, his face filled with pride. He stepped forward, embracing her tightly. "You did it," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You really did it." Maya pulled back, looking up at him with a small smile. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad, or without Chris." Chris approached them, his face still etched with disbelief, but his eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you, Maya, for everything. I don't know what I would have done without your support." She smiled, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You stood up for what was right, Chris. That takes more courage than anything else." Together, they left the building, stepping into the fresh air as a new chapter began. The battle had been hard fought, and the scars would remain, but they had proven that change was possible, that justice was worth fighting for. And Maya knew that no matter what came next, she would always stand up for what was right.
In the days following the disciplinary hearing, Maya felt the weight of the entire ordeal slowly lifting, though the journey had left her changed. Word spread quickly throughout the community. Eric Walker, the once untouchable fire chief, had been suspended and was facing serious consequences. People talked about it everywhere, and the decision sparked mixed reactions. Some were relieved, grateful that someone had finally stood up to his unchecked authority, while others clung to the belief that it was a travesty, a good man's career damaged by misguided complaints.
The night after the hearing, Maya sat with her father on the porch of her childhood home, the cool evening air settling around them in comfortable silence. Judge Hayes had been quiet, almost contemplative, since the decision was announced. He'd been supportive of her throughout, though she sensed his lingering unease at how publicly their family name had been drawn into the conflict. After a while, her father turned to her, his gaze steady. "You know, Maya, I've always believed that patience and diplomacy are the best paths forward. But seeing you stand up the way you did, I think you reminded me of something I may have forgotten." He gave her a small, proud smile. "Sometimes we have to be a little louder." Maya smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "It's funny, Dad. I kept hearing your voice in my head the whole time, warning me to be careful. But I think this was a time when careful wasn't enough." He nodded, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "You made me proud. And I think you made this community stop and think about what they accept, what they ignore. That's no small thing." The days following the hearing were challenging for Chris as well. While some of his fellow firefighters quietly supported him, others remained distant, wary of associating too closely. He knew that some relationships would take time to heal, while others might never fully recover. But he also found a surprising amount of support from unexpected corners, younger firefighters, rookies who saw in him a role model, someone who stood for integrity, even when it came at a personal cost. Maya continued to receive messages, many of them from people she didn't even know. Some thanked her, sharing their own experiences of feeling marginalized or ignored by authority figures. Others reached out to express newfound hope that perhaps change was possible. She even heard from a few people who had once defended Eric, now reaching out to apologize, acknowledging that maybe they hadn't understood the full picture. One day, Maya received a call from a local advocacy group. They'd heard about her story and wanted to meet with her to discuss the possibility of starting a new initiative, a community-led program focused on transparency and accountability in local institutions. The idea resonated deeply with her, stirring the same fire that had driven her to stand up to Eric. She knew firsthand the power of speaking out, of pushing back against complacency. Maybe this was a way to channel everything she'd learned into something lasting. Her father encouraged her to take the meeting, and together, they brainstormed ways the program could work. "You've always had a gift for rallying people, Maya," he told her one evening. "Maybe this is the start of something bigger than either of us realized." A week after the hearing, she and Chris were invited to speak at a small community gathering. She was nervous at first, unsure of how people would react, but the response was overwhelmingly positive. People came up to thank them, to tell them that what they had done had given the town a new perspective, a way to reflect on the authority figures they'd always trusted without question. Chris shared his story, speaking honestly about the challenges of standing up to someone in power, about the fears he'd faced and the sacrifices he'd made. His voice shook at times, but his courage was evident, and the room hung on every word. Maya spoke of resilience, of the importance of not giving in to intimidation, of the right everyone had to be heard and respected. She could see the impact of her words on the faces around her, the nods of agreement, the glimmers of understanding. And in that moment, she knew that everything they'd been through had meaning, that they had ignited something that couldn't be easily extinguished. After the event, as the crowd slowly dispersed, an older woman approached her, clutching Maya's hands with a fierce grip. "You did good, young lady," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "People like me. We've seen so much, being told to stay quiet too many times. But seeing you, it makes me feel like maybe, finally, we can start speaking up too." Maya's eyes filled with tears as she squeezed the woman's hands. "That means everything to me," she whispered, feeling a deep sense of connection that transcended words. As she walked home that evening, Maya felt a profound sense of peace. The journey had been long and difficult, marked by moments of doubt and pain, but it had brought her to a place of purpose she hadn't anticipated. She knew she would face new challenges, that Eric's threat lingered in the background, a reminder that not everyone was willing to change. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had her father's support, her community's respect, and Chris's friendship. Together, they had faced down something formidable, and they had emerged stronger. But Eric's suspension remained indefinite, and word spread that the department was taking measures to revise their protocols. It was a small victory, but an important one. The town was changing, slowly but surely, opening its eyes to the importance of accountability. Maya knew that this was only the beginning, that the fight for justice would continue, both in her life and in the lives of others who had felt silenced. Standing on her father's porch one last time, before heading back to her city apartment, she looked out at the town she'd grown up in, feeling an unexpected sense of connection. She knew she would return often, that her roots ran deeper than she'd realized. This place had shaped her, challenged her, and now, it had given her a purpose. And with that, she stepped forward, ready to carry the torch of change wherever it was needed. For herself, for her community, and for everyone who had ever been told to stay silent, Maya Hayes was just getting started.